Hi, Misha here, and I have a bit of an update video. In the past, I showed you and talked about the history of this model. This is the Douglas A-20, and this is the G variant, known as the Havoc. This is a light attack bomber aircraft. Really, it's splitting that difference between heavy fighter and light attack bomber. And this is one as used in the Pacific. Specifically, this is from the New Guinea campaign. 1/72 scale diecast from Hobby Master. It's an older release of theirs. But they just released a new version known as the Boston Mark IV, at least to the British. This would be their name for the A-20J. And this one is in European camouflage circa 1944. And the real main difference is the nose. This is more of a bomber variant, and it would actually lead a fleet. And it was equipped with the very famous Norden bomb sight, but of course at the expense of ordnance in the nose. Now it's late and I'm tired, and this is just going to be more of a quickie. The A-20 Havoc dates back to 1937. It started off as a bit of an internal concept at Douglas, known as the Model 7. It would be updated and made more powerful for trials in 1938 when the U.S. Army Air Corps released specifications, requirements for a new light attack bomber. Truth is, they weren't so much interested. It was kind of driven behind the scenes by France. And so in 1939, the White House ordered Douglas to work with France to develop this. The French were very impressed. It became known as the DB-7, and they just started to deliver these in 1940, but then the Germans invaded. So there were a handful in French service, but they were mostly working on the contract. Once France no longer could take them, now the Vichy would keep the ones they had for some time, even try using them briefly. The order would be diverted to the RAF, to the UK, where it became known initially as the Havoc Mark I. And then when they outfitted them as night fighters, with up to 8 303 machine guns and early radar, this is just big enough, powerful enough to carry early radar sets in 1941. It became known as the Havoc II. Then Douglas would make a version specifically for the British known as the DB-7B, which had extra fuel tankage, therefore extra range, a little extra armor. The French order, they were kind of thinking more as tactical attack planes or light bombers, so short range, relatively light payload. In fact, some of the early ones had a payload of less than 2,000 pounds. The DB-7B would have a payload initially of about 2,400 pounds and quite a bit more range. So the British took delivery of these aircraft and started using them as daylight attack craft bombers, and designated them as Boston 3. Boston would be what they would start calling the daytime versions, with Havoc reserved for nighttime use. Their first combat was in February of 1942 when they helped attack several German naval vessels, including the warship Scharnhorst and the cruiser Prince Eugen. And then in March they went on their first bombing raid across the Channel into Europe, where they attacked some ironworks of the Germans. They would later use them in North Africa and the Middle East, and they would be joined by U.S. Army Air Corps A-20s. Now, initially, the Army Air Corps wasn't too interested in this aircraft. It really didn't have the range and payload they wanted either. But thanks to the developments done by the British and French even, it became more attractive to them. And they would ultimately end up acquiring quite a few, at least over a brief time period. But probably the next biggest user would be Soviet Russia, who would get over 3,400 out of the nearly 7,500 built. Now this version here, the A-20G, would kind of be the first and most mass-produced version, the first kind of fully realized and most mass-produced version. It had more range and armor. In the nose, it had 6 .50 caliber machine guns forward-facing. It could carry up to 4,000 pounds in bombs. It could get up to about 325 miles per hour and fly just under 24,000 feet. In the back, we have a powered dorsal turret, which was a very new invention at the time. And just for a little added defense, we had one more .50 caliber machine gun on the ventral side, on the bottom, behind the bomb bays, meaning it had a total of 9 .50 caliber guns. They did try early on putting 4 20mm cannon in the front and 2 .50 caliber guns, but they just found the 50 cals, between their better accuracy and faster rate of fire, were more useful for defense, but mostly an attack, ground strafing or strafing naval vessels. So that's where they went there. Some early versions of the Havoc would have a crew of 4, but soon this would be settled on 3. You would have someone to operate the turret in the back. You had your main pilot. Now, interestingly, the cockpit is very fighter style. It's kind of a single seat. His crew would be behind him and below him to some extent on the deck. This really was, it looks like a light bomber, but it also has elements of a World War II heavy fighter, like a P-38 or a Bf-110. Really was one of those planes that couldn't quite make up its mind what it was. And for the day, it was reasonably fast. It was actually quite maneuverable. It could take a licking. Later versions like this had quite a bit of armor, and they could fly without too much fuss with one engine knocked out. And by this point, they had decent range. These were also well known for being very accurate, which the U.S. Army Air Forces used to great effect in the Pacific when they would send A-20s in to attack Japanese warehouses, railways, roads, even trucks, ships, other moving vehicles. They just, they were responsive at the controls. They were small enough they could get in low. They were fast enough, but not so fast. They could really deliver either a lot of 50 cal or, up to 4,000 pounds of bombs. But of course, if you loaded up fully, you would sacrifice range. So typically 2,500 pounds was a more common loadout, especially in the Pacific when fuel was at a premium, range between islands. Well, the U.S. Air Force was actually pleasantly surprised. By 1944, they were pulling these out of service, and it was being replaced with Douglas's own A-26, as well as the B-26 Marauder and other newer aircraft. So really, by the end of World War II, this is out of service. A few of them were kept, at least officially, on the books of the Air Forces, but in reality, they were out, and the last ones were struck off in 1949, so just before the Korean War. So these would not make it to the Korean War. By the way, dimensions, it's just about 48 feet long, with a wingspan of a bit over 61 feet. So big, but not huge. The cockpit was actually said to be very spacious, good field of view, well laid out instruments, easy for the pilot to work in, and most of them really enjoyed flying it. What about our new version here? Again, there's not a lot of difference. This is a British version. Of course, still built by Douglas. Instead of 50 cal guns in the back, we would typically have 303 in the turret. The British were really interested in using the A-20 as a bomber, and they did quite effectively throughout Europe, Italy, and down into Africa. In the night fighter role, it would be replaced by newer aircraft. The Americans would try out a night fighter version known as the P-70, but it was never up to snuff, and it was replaced by the P-61. The British would replace these, some by the Beaufighter, and others by the Mosquito. So it was pretty much in day use before D-Day, doing kind of pinpoint bombing raids. They would still use some at night in what they considered intruder roles, meaning they would fly over the channel and basically just harass the shit out of the Germans, so huzzah. After D-Day, these would be used to provide close air support to advancing troops, breaking out of the beachhead, going through France, liberating France, and then eventually crossing over into Germany. And occasionally they would be used for photo reconnaissance as well. So the British would hang on to them till the end of the war, which would be the end of Lend-Lease. And they were quite well received. Now this version, the A-20J, has an extended and glass nose, like I said, for an observer, a bombardier. He would use the famous Norden bomb sight. And these would be sent at the front of a bombing wing. Most of the bombers would be the standard older Boston 3 type, but they would be led by these so-called Boston 4s for getting that accuracy down, pinpoint, because when you only have a couple of 1,000 pounds of ordnance per plane, you really want to get it on target. Of course, the flip side, we still have the powered turret in the back, but in the front, we sacrifice 4 of our forward machine guns for our glass nose, but we do retain 2. On the American version, they would be 50 cals. On the British, they'd be 303s, but we still do have 2 forward-facing machine guns, but pretty significant reduction, frankly. These really were effective in helping the accuracy and effectiveness of Boston raids in 1944 and in 1945. However, the Germans were not stupid, and they learned to target these lead planes, because if they could knock these out, they could affect the lethality of the entire bomber group. So they were heavy profile targets. By the way, there was also the Boston Mark V, known as the A-20K. It was the exact same glass-nosed plane, it just had different engines. In World War II, they couldn't always get enough of one engine type to provide all the different planes that needed it, so it was always good to have different versions for different engines in case certain things were available. But Britain would, stop taking deliveries in 1944 or so when production would end. They would keep theirs in service until 1945, and then at the end of the war, per terms of Lend-Lease, they either had to purchase or return aircraft. And in most instances, they just scrapped them because the U.S. didn't want them back, and the British didn't want to pay for what were heavily used and whatnot. And of course, with them out of production, spare parts would become more and more difficult to find over the years. So even though 7,500 were made, which is a huge number by today's standards, and even a large respectable number by World War II standards, they really didn't much out-survive the war. But considering the main customer for this airplane vanished before they could even take delivery of 50 of them, France, and its second users, US and UK, kind of only did so reluctantly at first. Yeah, it's pretty successful. Also, Australia and New Zealand would fly a number of these. A very good airplane, much like Douglas planes. Dependable, durable, mechanically quite simple, not necessarily all that advanced. One of its most advanced features would be its turret. The Norden bomb sight too, of course, on this model. They were very liked in Russia. The Russians found them to be powerful, and they would actually put in even more rapid-fire cannon to increase their ground attack lethality against the invading Germans. But yeah, these Hobbymaster models are very similar, but there hasn't been a lot new out, and I didn't have a glass nose version. I've had this one here for quite a while. They are nearly all metal, pretty heavy considering the size. They also stay on their stands very well. The turrets do rotate. A bit interestingly, it only comes with one crew figure. You can take the top off, I should say, the cockpit, and put him in there, but there's no one in the turret, and there's no way to take the turret off, I guess because it rotates. So it's kind of odd for Hobbymaster. They usually give you a full crew. For example, with the Beaufighter, they do. You get a rear guy. Of course, gear up or down. The only kind of flaw, they forgot to put a little bit of detailing on the engines. They do actually give you little plastic racks with those little pieces you can break off and glue them on yourself, but I've never bothered. It sounds like it's more trouble than it's worth. That's usually what Hobbymaster does. If someone, once they've already got a mold and everything set up, it's very hard to change it, because of the costs. So they'll usually add supplemental parts to the box to let the end user make the corrections. They just most recently did it with the MiG-23. The guns are neat in the nose, but also I think this the glass nose is quite neat. I like the light bomber look that it gives it, and I think it's neat that these were guide aircraft in the war. And you get the European camo. So now I've got one of each of the major variants, and I've got one from the Pacific Theater and one from the European. Yeah, these are nice quality models. Again, a couple of oddities like the engine details and the fact you only get one crewman. But otherwise, pretty neat. Hobbymaster is quite consistent. They may not always deliver the absolute pinnacle, but at the same time, they really don't deliver junk. They're just consistently, dependably good, and that can count for a lot with the cost of these things. You don't want to go buying models only to find out they're crap. But I have a thing for bombers, as you know. I have a thing for everything, but I just thought I'd show you this new one that came in from Pete's Collectibles a couple of weeks ago. Just haven't had a chance to record anything on it before that. If you like bombers, check out, I've got an entire playlist called Bomber Command, where it's everything from B-17s to B-29s, B-52s, even the Tupolev Tu-4. If you have any questions or comments, please do post them below. And as always, if you could like, share, and subscribe, that would be greatly appreciated. With that, I'm going to call it a night. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.